Hello and welcome to another episode of the Military History Club's Great Battle in 10 Minutes feature. Today I'm talking about the Battle of Amiens that was fought from the 8th to the 12th of August 1918 in central France between an Anglo-French force under Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig and the German 2nd and 18th Armies under General Erich Ludendorff. It resulted in a major Allied breakthrough, the start of the so-called 100 Days Offensive that would end the war, and was described by Ludendorff as the Black Day of the German army. The Germans had begun the year with a series of offensives, notably on the Somme and Marne rivers and at Ypres, that made major advances but no decisive breakthrough. By July, their offensive power was spent, and the Allies sought to take advantage. A key element in the attack by General Sir Henry Rawlinson's British Fourth Army at Amiens, to be led by the British Third Corps, the Australian Corps and the Canadian Corps, was secrecy. There was to be no softening up bombardment. Instead, the Fourth Army's 1,386 field guns and howitzers and 684 heavy guns would only fire as the troops advanced, targeting German batteries with phosgene and gas, while field guns protected the infantry with a creeping barrage. Every gun shot together and the thing was off, recalled gunner Bertie Cox of the 14th Brigade Royal Field Artillery. I laid and fired the gun myself. After 3 hours I was practically deaf. We fired our first shot at 4:20 a.m. at 800 yards, and in 3 hours the enemy was out of our range. Within 10 minutes of the start, the tanks by the hundreds and cavalry by the thousands were passing our guns. A crewman of one of the 552 British Mark V and Whippet tanks supporting the attack that day, representing the entire Tank Corps fleet, was Private Charles Rowland. It was 4:20 a.m, time to move, he recalled, and all of a sudden a mist fell over the area, which pleased us but did not help the navigator. But it did not last long, and we were on our way to the first line with all the machine guns firing. Slowly moving towards that, we found that the barrage had not killed all the enemy troops, but what was left were coming out with their hands up. But it was the Canadians' job to see to them, and we started to crawl into and out of the trenches, being bumped here and there, sideways, all over the place. By mid-morning, Rowland was through all 3 lines of the German forward zone. What a sight met the eye as far as we could see. Tanks moving forward, infantry behind, taking shelter from them, hundreds of field guns following. The whole lot looked as if it was on parade. A few tanks in Rowland's 14th Battalion were now destroyed by concealed German guns that had been missed by counter-battery fire. But most crewmen only had to contend with ditching, mechanical trouble, small arms fire, and the suffocating atmosphere inside these steel monsters. So rapid was the advance by the tanks, cavalry and infantry in the Australian and Canadian sectors, in the centre and on the right of the BEF attack, that a German ammunition train was surprised as it entered Harbonnières station. Struck by 6-pounder shells, it burst into one great sheet of flame, reaching to a height of not less than 150 feet, recalled Captain Henry Smedel, commanding a section of specially elongated Mark V tanks. He added, "Needless to say, that train was stopped. It was followed by another, a passenger train rushing up fresh troops. This was running on another rail and ran right into our lines. It was captured, complete with personnel." By nightfall, the Canadian and Australian corps had gained nearly all their objectives. Less successful was the British Third Corps, attacking north of the River Somme, which was held up on its first objective and failed to take the Chilpilly Spur. There were reasons for this. The divisions of Third Corps had suffered badly in earlier fighting and were largely made up of recent drafts from home. 2 of them had been weakened by a local German attack on the 6th and 7th of August, and the ground they were attacking was intersected by gullies and spurs that precluded the use of many of the supporting tanks and greatly aided the defence. Even so, the gains that day made by Rawlinson's Fourth Army were spectacular. An advance of 8 miles on a 10-mile front, the furthest advance on the Western Front in one day since 1914, with the French mirroring this success to the south. Even more extraordinary was the imbalance in casualties. The BEF lost 9,000 men, the Germans 27,000, including 12,000 prisoners of war, and 450 guns. How, given the relative success of the German spring offensives, did this sudden turnaround occur? Part of the answer lies in the war weariness of the enemy. By the time the last German offensive, which came to be known as the Second Battle of the Marne, ended on the 4th of August, the Allies had driven the Germans back to the River Aisne, thereby snuffing out most of the Champagne Bulge and re-established the vital railway link between Paris and Chalon-sur-Marne. Ludendorff suffered a mini-nervous breakdown during this setback and arguably never properly recovered his poise. On the 2nd of August, he urged his commanders to adopt the strategic defensive, hoping to return soon to the attack. He never did so. The spring offensives had cost the Germans 1 million men and severely depleted their stockpile of munitions. They would soon lose another 1 million men to Spanish influenza. Meanwhile, the Allies were growing steadily stronger. By the 20th of July, there were almost 1.9 million American soldiers on French soil. Between April and July, the number of French fighter aircraft rose from 797 to 1,070, while the army took delivery of 500 Renault light tanks. This extra firepower tipped the balance in the fighting on the Marne. Marshal Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, acknowledged that a turning point had been reached in a memorandum that he distributed to his senior commanders on the 24th of July. The Allies now had the advantage, and to keep it, they needed to deliver a series of sharp, surprise attacks, each with a specific objective, and to halt them before the enemy brought in reserves. He did not expect victory until 1919, but the sooner the better. The Battle of Amiens was the first major British contribution to this new strategy. Rawlinson's orders were to advance 6 miles to the outer Amiens defence line, an old French defensive position that lay on the edge of the old Somme battlefield. If the attack went well, he was to continue on to Schoen and, ideally, to Ham on the Somme. He was using fewer troops than he had on the 1st of July 1916, probably no more than half the 100,000 soldiers who had attacked that day, but they were far better trained and, more importantly, enjoyed a huge advantage in firepower. As well as many more tanks, the Allies had 4 times as many aircraft as the defending Germans, more heavy guns, 8 times as many Lewis guns per battalion than in 1916, 8 trench mortars instead of 2, and 16 grenade-firing rifles. Moreover, they faced dispirited German units that had recently arrived in the line, knew their positions only poorly, and were outnumbered 2 to 1. Haig was understandably delighted by the day's results on the 8th of August. Who would have believed this possible even 2 months ago, he wrote to his wife. How much easier is it to attack than to stand and await an enemy's attack? A major factor in the day's success was Haig's insistence on the use of horsemen. Without the rapid advance of the cavalry, he wrote later, the effect of the surprise attack on the 8th would have been much less, and very probably the Amiens outer defence line would not have been gained either so soon or so cheaply. With a less effective artillery bombardment and fewer tanks available, the British Expeditionary Forces advance slowed on the 9th of August, though the Canadians still gained 4 miles. By the end of the 11th of August, the Fourth Army was just short of Schoen, at which point Rawlinson requested a halt in operations. Foch was reluctant to grant more than a brief pause, but Haig stood his ground. It was an important moment. The Allies, wrote historian David Stevenson, would no longer batter away along the same sector beyond the point of diminishing returns. The secret of success lay not only in new technology and good preparation, but also in a willingness to halt while the going was good before starting again elsewhere. With total losses of 75,000 men, 50,000 captured during the 4-day battle, compared to French and British losses of 22,000 men each, Ludendorff acknowledged that the morale of the German army was no longer what it had been. On the 13th of August, with this in mind, he told Hindenburg and the Chancellor, Prince Max of Baden, that it was no longer possible to force the enemy to sue for peace by an offensive. The only alternative was a negotiated settlement. A day later, the Kaiser seemed to agree with this assessment and instructed von Hintze, the Foreign Secretary, to open up peace negotiations, if possible, through the medium of the Queen of Netherlands. The stage was now set for a series of Allied victories, the so-called 100 Days, that would force the Germans to sue for peace. Thank you.